clearly that people wanted me to focus in on some things like best practices and the like. But I'm also conscious that, you know, there's been a huge growth in people coming into the hobby. When people join the Facebook group, they're asked to answer a question, and the vast majority of people do. And, you know, as with prior years, you know, there's the usual a bunch of ex-law users, ex-Vixen users, new people to the hobby. And this year, a fairly significant crowd of people coming from the home automation space into doing Christmas light displays, or in some cases, just looking to control LED lighting on their house as architectural highlights, etc. And so, yeah, there's a whole bunch of new people coming in, and so there are some things that I'll go over which are more basic, and make sure I send people in the right direction for learning about RGB lighting. So let's start off with the real basics, which is things like, you know, whereabouts do you go for information about animated light control? And obviously one of the great starting points is the Xlights homepage itself. If you come up to the videos page, you get to the Xlights video collection. Now, these aren't just Xlights videos. These are videos made by all sorts of people that have been collected together here under the Xlights page because they're interesting and relevant. And anyone can suggest a video. You just come up here, click on the suggest video link, and you can add in a video. So if you've done a setup video, a behind the scenes video, etc., and it's on YouTube or Vimeo, and you'd like to share it for people to access, you can do so just by clicking on the suggest video link, and it gets added to our queue. We review it, check that it's relevant, and it'll get added in and categorized, etc. So we encourage people to do that. It's a great asset. There's literally hundreds of videos here on all sorts of different topics, not just software, right? A lot of hardware, prop-based, controller-based, all sorts of things in here. A lot of X Essentials stuff, including the new X Essentials Lite series that that the guys have been putting together. So a great asset. On top of that, there are YouTube channels. So I have a YouTube channel. Wow, it's a bit slow. Which will come up eventually. Where I publish all of my videos. They are generally available in the videos.xlights, but if you subscribe here, you'll receive notifications when we release new videos. Generally, most of my videos are release update videos. These seminars, this is the one we did back in September where we went through buffers and layers, but occasionally there are also more specific videos that came out, and I'm going to try and do a few more videos this year. I do love Jeff's site, Can a Spade of Christmas. So he has a YouTube channel. This is a great site for beginners. He does a lot more hardware, does a bit of Falcon Player. So yeah, Jeff's got a great sense of humor, and, you know, makes things really simple and easy, and great site for new guys to come in and learn a lot about stuff. You definitely can't go past the Oz Christmas Lighting 101 manual. You will need to sign up as a member of the site to gain access to the manual, but you can download the manual just here. And it's a great written introduction to RGB lighting. It's probably the best that's available in written form, just as a general introduction. It's not Xlight specific. It's really an introduction to lighting in general. Xlights itself, if you go back to the Xlights page, we have a manual here as well, which you can access. These days it's an online manual. You can't download it as a PDF anymore, or maybe you can export it. I don't know how good that is as a format, but there's a manual here. FPP also has a manual. I'm not going to go find that right now, but there are manuals for those things, and definitely worthwhile looking at. I just understand that the Xlights manual struggles to keep up, but if you'd like to volunteer to help, I think if you reach out to someone like Scott Hansen, They're always looking for people to lend a hand with documenting Xlights and providing guidance to people on how to use it. Obviously, you can't go past the Xlights Facebook page, the official site. If you go to xlights.org/Facebook, you can get here, or you can search for it on Facebook. This is definitely the hub of most activity. There's more than 8,500 members of the Facebook group these days. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Yeah, 8,700. That grows. I think we're 5,000 this time last year. So it grows substantially. It's not doubling every year anymore, but it's still growing substantially. And then there's always the old Nutcracker forum. Now, the Nutcracker forum is also Xlights related. It's a classic forum. It has definitely got a lot less traffic on it, but it tends to be more problem based, and you'll tend to get the developers responding to most things in here. So yeah, there's a couple of places that you can start. Now there are others. There's Do It Yourself Christmas, DIY Christmas. There's obviously the Falcon forums, as well as the Falcon Facebook page, etc., etc. Right. So that's not all of them, but there is a huge number of sites out there. In terms of access to material and introductory material, it's moved on in leaps and bounds from what it used to be, where there used to be very little available. These days, it's almost too much. You could spend the rest of the year just watching videos on RGB lighting and not actually get any time to build anything. But definitely start there, and you can find the others, and ask questions. So that's it. The other, I'd also be remiss of not mentioning the GitHub site. So GitHub, for those that have not come across GitHub before, fundamentally it's a source repository. So this is actually the source code to Xlights. Now, the vast majority of users don't need to access the source code of Xlights, but it is here, and there's useful documents inside the repository as well, including, how to go about building it. There's API references. So if you go into the Xschedule folder, there's an API reference in here, which talks about how to interact with Xschedule over a web interface and get it to do all sorts of interesting things. For those that are absolutely, who really want to understand a little bit more about about ZCPP, and I'm not sure where it is in here now anymore, but there is, maybe it's a download folder. No,
it was downloaded.
Sorry, but there is a document in here. There it is there, Zero Configuration Pixel Protocol. So if you want to understand what ZCPP really is under the surface, the entire protocol is actually documented here. So there are a few useful things inside the code repository. Most users will interact through it with GitHub, though, on the issues page. So this is our formal bug tracker for Xlights. So you can come in here and lodge defects or suggest enhancements in here. We do ask that people spend a bit of time, check to see that their issue hasn't been raised before. When you do create a new issue, if you're going to create a bug report, you'll get this template. Please read the template very carefully and make sure that you follow it and provide a really concise description of the bug, really detailed steps about how to reproduce it, and or a link to a video which shows it and explains what's going on. These things, if we can't reproduce your defect, effectively we're not going to do anything with it. Screenshots, be very clear on the versions. Attach a copy of a sequence or your layout or whatever that might help us reproduce the problem. When we get a good bug report, it usually gets dealt with within 24 to 48 hours and it's included in the next release. When we get a really bad bug report, we'll often just close it because there's nothing in the report that's useful to us. It does get very frustrating when we have to keep on going back and asking people you know, to provide additional information so that we can try and reproduce the problem. So yeah, please, if you're going to raise a request in here, particularly if you can reproduce a problem, if you're experiencing a crash and you can reproduce it reliably, then taking the time to raise a bug report in here and getting it fixed obviously helps you, but it helps others as well. It's kind of the quid pro quo of free software is, you know, one of your ways in which you can contribute back to the project is helping us fix the problems that might exist. Xlates is a very, very large program. Just because you're experiencing it doesn't mean that other people are experiencing the problem. There are lots of problems that we see that are quite unique to particular scenarios. And so if you don't spend the time to raise the defect and explain how to reproduce it. Now, some people think that because when Xlates crashes and you click the OK button, we receive a copy of the crash log, that we can somehow miraculously understand what was happening and fix it. That sometimes happens, but you know, it really happens probably 10 to 20% of the time. 80 to 90% of the time, we need information in a bug report in order to work out what went wrong and how to fix it. So please do take the time to raise those reports and get things fixed. So that's GitHub. Zoom, I mean, obviously everyone online right now is in Zoom, but for those that are maybe watching the video later, the Zoom room, which you can access via the Xlates page here via this blue button, you can click on the Zoom meeting, or if you happen to be inside Xlates, if you go to the help, there's a Zoom menu item just here. It takes you into an online meeting room. It's essentially a video conferencing / audio conferencing room where people that are working with Xlates and other lighting technology gather from time to time. Now, it does vary over the course of the year. If you've come into the hobby in the last couple of months, you've probably experienced the Zoom room as a place where there seems to be always people there ready to talk and answer questions and help you solve problems. That won't be the true throughout the entire year. You'll find that it rapidly drops off and becomes something that's, you know, there are people in here occasionally, obviously commonly in the evening US time after work, but, you know, most commonly on Wednesday nights, the US folks run their existential program, which starts, I think, again in early February, and will probably run the bulk of the year, where they'll have various people come in and do presentations, and you saw many of those in the videos page. They do record them and share them, often several weeks after they get done, but they become available. And those things cover a huge array of topics. They are not just Xlates related. They cover hardware and you know, even non-Christmas things, Halloween, etc. Anything that's got even a tenuous relationship to lighting, etc., seems to get a Guernsey, and it can be a great way to learn a whole bunch of new and interesting things. So that runs on a Wednesday night. It starts at 8 Eastern, I think, typically when they run presentations, but people gather earlier and stay later, and it's a great chance to catch up. For those guys in Australia, that equivalent is typically on a Friday night. Starts, you know, any time from 7 o'clock-ish onwards and runs to quite late. Much less formal than the US. We don't tend to do formal presentations, but there are people in there talking about lights and answering questions and whatever. And then obviously August through December, it gets extremely busy with people doing setup and solving controller configuration issues, etc. You know, and there's a huge team of guys in there who gave up a huge amount of time just to get everyone's show up and running. And look, I think it's just awesome what they do. So yeah, look, if you need help, pop into the Zoom room. You can go in at any time. Please make sure you have a microphone. If you don't have a microphone on your computer, you can dial in on your telephone, either using the app or dialing in. There are actually local numbers if you go to zoom.us, and that's regardless of where you are in the world. You'll find there is a list of telephone numbers that you can access it with. So if you don't have a computer, sorry, if you don't have a microphone on your computer, you can still dial in and get audio access to the Zoom room. If you've got a problem, be ready to share your screen because we can see your screen and help identify what your problem is. If the room's busy and there's people talking, there is a way in Zoom to put up your hand. That's the polite way to request assistance or to ask a question. But if no one's talking, you can just speak up and say hello. And people mostly respond. You do occasionally get the odd person who's gone to bed and left Zoom connected, but generally someone's in there, they're going to answer you and hopefully sort out your problems. So that's the Zoom room. I would be remiss not to talk about Expo. So Christmas Expo is, at least from a DIY perspective, is probably the premier Christmas conference for the year, just in terms of number of attendees, etc. It's a very formal program. It is a commercial enterprise, unlike the minis, which I'll come to in a minute. So this year it's in Vegas. It's being held, the conference itself is the 16th to 18th of July, but there's also pre-conference workshops on the 14th and 15th of July. Sean and I think, well, I suspect Gil this year, given it's in Vegas, which is not that far from Arizona, will be there to teach classes on X-Lights. We do a beginner and a more advanced class. Basically runs 8 hours a day, and it's a very in-depth exploration of X-Lights and its functionality and techniques, etc., etc. So that will be happening just before the conference, and then it's 2.5 days, or 2 3/4 days, I think, of actual conference, including a vendor hall, etc. So it's a lot of fun, and then of course there is an enormous amount of socialising that goes on around the conference as well. So definitely a great experience. It's about 90% DIY. There is also another conference in St. Louis called Transworld that goes on. I think it's early March. It's recently become a Christmas. It's predominantly a Halloween conference, but they introduced a fairly significant Christmas piece last year. It's a little bit more commercially orientated. There's definitely a number of the DIY crowd that do turn up, but the conference itself is fundamentally at its core a commercial. They're basically, the Halloween one is about supporting people that are doing Halloween more commercially, and Christmas is similarly, although they're a little bit more lenient from a Christmas perspective. It doesn't have the same style of classes with the Christmas Expo. You pay to attend the conference, and you can attend any of the classes, and they run 6 or 7 classes, every session. Whereas Transworld, you tend to, I think, buy individual classes. Now, that may be more efficient. They're quite expensive too, I think, at Transworld. But it obviously, you can focus then in on the things that you want to see. I understand that their vendor hall is absolutely amazing at Transworld. It's a little bit more basic at Christmas Expo. But yeah, there are some options. Minis are held in towns across US and Australia. They're held at all different times of the year. I think the first one is probably the one in Florida, which I think is in February sometime. But yeah, there is almost certainly a mini Christmas conference that's within 1,000 kilometres or so. Well, what's that? 1,000 kilometres or so of pretty much everybody, and you just need to go and locate those. Now, there is a post on Facebook that Ed put out, which I'm sure he will bump and make more visible over the next few days, if not today. I know he's on. But yeah, each of those groups typically has their own Facebook page where you can go and join. Those groups, they're not as active as the main group, but they're obviously more local to you, and so they can be a great place to organise things like local build parties and the minis. And they really are, right? If I went back to, and I don't have Ed's post here, but this is the Heartland Minis page in Kansas. But there's groups in Florida, Alabama. There's one called Tri-State, which covers the sort of New Jersey-ish type area. There's Michigan, Southern Indiana, Chicago, Georgia, North Texas, South Carolina, Utah, DC, Louisiana, Arizona, California, North and South, Washington State, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Ohio, Central Texas, Colorado. They're everywhere. So
it's
definitely
in chat.
going.
The link is in chat.
Oh, is it? Oh, so it is. So this is the Facebook link where Ed posted, and we should like it or something, Ed, so it pops back up again. But there's a whole bunch. All these links are in here for the various groups. You should definitely find a group that's nearby to you. And if you get a chance to go along to the minis, they are definitely worth attending. Now, they vary significantly. Some of them will run for just a single day. Others will run for 2 days or 2.5 days. They often include social events, after hours, etc. Definitely worthwhile attending. If you're in Australia, the minis are organised via the Oz Christmas lighting site, and you can see that they're already starting to organise Sydney and Brisbane and the like this year. So yeah, if you're in Australia, you definitely want to get to these conferences. Now they do, they are spread quite significantly over the course of the year. As I said, the Florida one's in, I think it's in February, Ed.
February 28th and 29th.
There you go, just in February. But they run through until about August or so. So yeah, you need to look it up and set some reminders, etc., so you don't miss them. If you're not sure when it's going to be, reach out. If there's not one near you, most of these groups, etc., have been created on the back of conversations on one of the lighting forums or a Facebook post, etc., looking for people nearby, and people self-organise themselves. Now, these are all volunteer run. You know, this is just people who are interested, getting together and sharing knowledge. It's a great opportunity to get hands-on with equipment that you otherwise may only read about online. I definitely in the past have not bought any hardware until I've attended a mini, because getting hands-on with hardware and understanding what can and can't be done and how it works is so much easier once you're in a mini than it is you know, sitting online and watching video after video, and you know, listening to people with various points of view and pushing various agendas, including myself. So, you know, it is a really big part of the hobby, attending a mini. All right. Okay, so where do we want to go next? I'm about to get into X-Lights, so don't panic. All right. All right. So before we actually start on X-Lights itself, there has been a bit of chatter recently around the X-Lights release philosophy. We got to 74 releases last year. We won't get anywhere near close to that this year, I don't think. Last year was a big year, what with the introduction of 3D and the like. It just led to a lot of development activity and enhancements. But, you know, some people have said, well, we release too often, I can't keep up, etc. And this is kind of deliberate. The reason we release so often is because it enables us to manage or understand where things have gone wrong and fix them more quickly. While we could go with a release philosophy that says that we'd release once a year, etc., it would mean that sometime in July or August, etc., we drop some massive version of X-Lights with thousands of changes. And we invariably run into lots of issues, and isolating exactly what went wrong, when it went wrong, etc., would be extremely difficult. By releasing roughly weekly, we're able to get changes in your hands more quickly. We're able to get early feedback on features. We're able to adapt and fix. We very rarely are not backwards compatible. So if you upgrade to a version and find that there's a problem, as well as reporting what that problem is, you can typically just drop back to a prior release and get going again, etc., if you do hit that sort of problem. Occasionally, we will have a release where There's no easy way to go back, and 2019.1 was one of those. A year ago when we went to 3D, once you went to 3D, it was very difficult to go back. And we provide lots of warnings, and we give you that additional information at the time of the release to say that, look, if you're going to go forward from here, there's no going back, etc. So we do typically give those warnings. But with most general releases, you could just reinstall. In fact, you don't even need to reinstall. You can keep multiple versions of Xlights installed on a machine and jump forward and backwards at any time between those releases. Yes, you will run into the occasional thing that obviously didn't exist in the old version and does exist in the new version. But generally speaking, going forward 1 or 2 releases, or backwards 1 or 2 releases is not going to be a problem. So yeah, look, I'm a big fan of releasing fast. It does give us that quick feedback, and it does mean that bugs get fixed very quickly. Generally speaking, you report a bug, it's fixed in the next release, so a week later it's working as expected. All right, so actually let's spend some time on Xlights itself. I did want to talk about the settings and the key settings that you need to be thinking about that might cause you to have issues if you don't get them right. So I'm going to go through the view menu and the settings menu, and I'm not going to go through all of the options, but I'm going to highlight a couple of ones which I think you really want to think very carefully about. Render on save, by default it's often turned on, I think. Unless it's the show time of the season and you definitely want to make sure everything's perfect, I would generally speaking recommend people turn this off. Having render on save on just slows down the saving process, and it's generally not necessary. Xlights will generally keep the rendering up to date, and when it saves, it writes the FSCQ file to disk. Some people think that when you do a render all, that it updates the FSCQ file. It doesn't. It's saving the file or saving your sequence that actually writes the FSCQ file to disk. Doing a render on save just creates that additional render. Now it does guarantee that everything is, it's like doing a render all and then a save. But generally speaking, this is not needed. And if you're not about to go and play your show on, send your FSCQ file to your show player, whether it's Xschedule or FPP, it's generally speaking not needed. So I would generally turn this option off for most of the year. The save FSCQ on save, turn this on. In fact, if you try to turn it off, you'll get a warning saying that this is a really stupid thing to do. And it is a really stupid thing to do. So please make sure that you have the save FSCQ on save. It's an option I'd like to remove. But backup and save I don't generally turn on, but backup on launch I think is a really, really good idea. Now, the only time you may not want to do this is if you've already got some mechanism in place on your machine, which guarantees that you keep a copy of earlier versions. What backup on launch does is when you launch Xlights, it goes and it copies all of your sequence files and your layout files, etc., into the backup folder and guarantees that you have a snapshot of what your machine or what your setup looked like at the beginning of that editing session. Backup on save does the same thing, except every time you save, it creates another backup of everything. I tend to think that's a little excessive, but backup on launch I would absolutely do. It also guarantees that if something weird happens, let's say we put out a version of Xlights that screwed up everything, the backup on launch really guarantees that when you launch that new version, we grabbed a copy of everything and you can always go back to it. So I would generally put that on. The purge backups option, look, I mean, as you can see, well, it's definitely not on here, but basically the backup folder can get very, very large. I mean, very, very large. And you may want to purge older ones. It depends on how you use the backups. If you almost never go in and you really just want to know that, look, if something's screwed up, I want to know that I can go and grab it, and set it to 31 days or something. And that way Xlights will stop the backup folder growing out of control. up to you. Backup subfolders, this is an option that you absolutely should turn on. If you don't turn on backup subfolders, then it's only going to back up things that are in your show folder itself. Now I'm going to come back and talk about what show folders are. But you know, if you have a sequences folder where you then store your sequences, if you don't have this option selected, then Xlights is not going to back up your sequences. So, you know, I would turn this on every time. Sorry, I'll just quickly flick through these. Render cache. It's up to you. The render cache is a mechanism whereby Xlights manages a set of files that can get quite large and can drive a lot of memory use on your machine as well. But what it can do is it can significantly speed up render time, particularly for some effects that are quite slow to render. If you enable this, basically Xlights will cache a copy of an effect pre-rendered, and then rather than having to go back and redo all of the work, it will read that render data out of that file. I would generally particularly recommend you turn this on if you're using things like video effects and the like, because videos can be quite slow to render, particularly if you've got something like a 4K video that you're rendering onto I don't know, a 200 by 200 panel or something, right? That's going to take a long time to render because Xlights has to basically take that video and compress it all the way down. And by building the render cache, what it does is it keeps a copy of that video pre-rendered. And so next time it goes to render it, it doesn't have to go back to the 4K video. It can just pull the data out of that render cache file. If you set it to locked effects only, then when you're in the sequencer, you can lock an effect. Lock an effect, and what it will do is it will only keep the render cache for those locked effects. So you can, once you're happy with an effect, you can go and lock it, and at that point, Xlights will say, okay, well now I'm gonna stick that into the render cache, and I'll pull it out of there going forward. What else is there here? OpenGL, you would generally have this in auto detect. If these options here are really only used if you start to experience problems with your display. Generally, I'd have it in auto detect unless you don't need to. If you do run into issues with display, we would generally suggest that you update your video hard drivers before you start playing with any of these options. Autosave. By default, autosave is set on 3 minutes. I would generally recommend that you have autosave set onto 3 minutes. The only time that we would suggest that you set it to longer is maybe you've imported a sequence from Lightorama or something, and it's created thousands and thousands of node level effects, and your sequence files can get quite large. At that point, it can actually be quite slow to autosave. And so if you're finding that every 3 minutes Xlights just seems to freeze, then you might want to bump out the autosave time. But if you're not experiencing issues, generally speaking, an autosave takes less than a second. And the benefit you get is obviously if there's an issue, Xlights will have that autosave file that you can go back and recover from and not lose anything. So definitely suggest you have autosave turned on if you can. FSCQ version. So this changed in the last year. There's now a number of different FSCQ file versions. Generally speaking, we would recommend the V2Z standard file format. The V1 is the old file format. These files are quite large, whereas the Z standard or the zlib are actually quite small. The Z standard one is the one that when V2 came out, this was the one that we used. These were added afterwards to support some controllers that were either unable to or couldn't afford the memory to support this compression method. These files also support things like the sparse layout, which allows us to create FSCQ files that consist only of a subset of the data that controller needs. But yeah, go with the Z standard if you can. and that's about it. On here, the hardware video decoder, by default, this is off on Windows and on OS X. On Windows, it's a bit experimental. I'm not entirely happy with what it does. It doesn't work on all machines, and I find that the videos, when they are produced, are a lot harsher than the software video decoder, but it does run a lot faster. OS X, I believe, is a lot better, so that's why it's on by default on OS X. In the view menu, there's a couple of things here. If you're still doing or coming from Lighterama or doing a lot of AC sequencing, you definitely may want to turn on the AC toolbar for sequencing AC lights. The other thing that I would generally turn on is the Perspectives autosave. What that does is it saves your screen layout every time you shut X-Lite, so X-Lite always opens up looking like it looked like before. The power of this is that, particularly when you're doing imports and you're opening up other people's layouts, instead of using the layouts inside their files, it will use your layout, which is set up for your screen. So I would always turn that one on. And that's it. The rest of the settings, I mean, you can play with, etc., but they're not the key ones. Now, if I go in and, I don't know, let's turn some things off. Let's be unadvisable. Let's go and turn a few things off. Okay, so now if I run check sequence these days, it's now going to give me some warnings here, and in fact an error. So it says here that backup is not including subfolders. If you store your sequences in subfolders, they are not being backed up by X-Lites, etc. So now check sequence is actually going to give you some warnings around some of the poorer option choices that you may make. Not saving the FSCQ on save. I consider this an error because it's a really bad idea. But yeah, so check sequence now also provides some advice on those settings. All right, so that's X-Lite's settings. Any questions? No, chat's very quiet. So let's talk about show folders then. So let me bring up my show folder. Not because my show folder is necessarily virtuous, but it is what it is. So my show folder is actually this home folder, and you can tell your show folder because your show folder contains the X-Lites networks and the X-Lites RGB effects files down here. That is my show folder. Now, so technically, when we talk about, well, what is your show folder, my show folder is home. Not this entire path. My show folder is actually this home folder. Everything prior to my show folder just happens to be where my show folder is installed on my machine. And as you know, people who are using multiple machines, people that are moving between OS X and Windows, people that are loading show folders from other users to import their sequences, etc. This part of the show folder or this part of the path, etc., is always going to be different on every single person's machine. The only thing that remains constant over time is this folder here. And therefore, this is the thing that X-Lites anchors on. Everything is expressed relative to the home folder underneath it. So that means that everything that you use in your sequences, everything you refer to in your setup should exist either in the home folder or in a subfolder of the home folder. And if you follow that rule and you follow that rule reliably, when X-Lites, when you move the data from machine to machine, you will find that everything continues to work perfectly because X-Lites has the smarts to go in and work out where things are relative to that show folder. If you start referring to files that are outside of the home folder in folders elsewhere, not underneath it, then as you move from machine to machine, you're going to find that file links start to break, your videos start to turn red, your images are missing, your audio file doesn't load, etc., etc. And that all happens because people don't follow the very simple rule of making sure that all of the content in their sequence sits under here. Now, a classic way that you can see this is if someone has a package sequence, if there is that underscore loss folder inside the file that you download, the reason that exists there is because that person had files that weren't inside their show folder. And so as part of the packaging process, Xlights had to go and round all of those files up and put them into the loss folder so that they would exist within the show folder, so that when you loaded that sequence onto your machine, it worked correctly. So please make sure that all of your content sits either in your show folder or underneath your show folder. Now, for similar reasons, don't include the date inside your show folder. If you were to call this, Home 2019, and then when you go next year and you rename it to Home 2020, all of your links will break because your show folder's name has changed. So please, if you must put a date in it, put the date down here. Create mylights.git/2020/home, right? That's okay. The 2020 can exist anywhere here. That's okay. You don't want to have the year in your show folder name because it will break. What's the best way to fix that mistake? Probably the best way to fix the mistake is you could go in and it's not easy to fix that mistake. You can bulk edit path names, and I can show you the bulk edit functionality if you want. But if you've made that mistake, you could leave everything where it was, go and create a new show folder and start to bring stuff across into it. As long as the old folder still exists, Xlights will still go and access it. So if I had let's say I had a Home 2019 and I create a Home 2020 and I copy everything into it, everything won't break immediately. And the reason it doesn't break immediately is because all of those references are still looking back in the 2019 folder, and the 2019 folder is still there, so everything continues to work. The problem is a year or two from now, when you're working on your sequences in 2024, and it's still referring back to 2019, and you decide 2019 is a long time ago, I don't need that anymore, and you delete the 2019 folder, that's when everything breaks. Which is a bit awkward. But there is a way to bulk edit path names. It's a bit of work to go and do. Yeah, there's no simple way to refix it. There's no global search replace. I generally don't recommend that people go and edit the XML files directly. While you can do that, it's risky, and if you break something, there's no easy way back from it other than restoring a backup. There is one other thing that I would mention is that having chosen the name Home as my show folder name, I should not reuse the Home folder as a folder name within any of these directories. And the reason for that is that when Xlights is trying to resolve things, if I go in and I had imported and I had another Home folder in here, then Xlights will get confused because it will think that Home folder might be this Home folder, and so some things won't correctly fix up as you open up sequences. So don't reuse the name, and that's why you want to be careful of generic words like Christmas, etc., because often you'll import a sequence from someone and they'll use Christmas or something as their show folder name, and at that point in time you also start to run into issues. So be careful about using generic words. A great show folder name would be the name of your show, because that's something that's obviously not something you're likely to reproduce elsewhere within it. When you are importing sequences from other people, create an imported folder or something inside your show folder, and that's where you should be placing your imported sequences. Don't go and put it in your downloads folder or on your desktop, etc., because again, you're going to run into those issues of not having all of the images or video file paths fixed up correctly. By putting them into an imported folder, it guarantees that it sits underneath my show folder, and so any image references, etc., are all going to be correctly maintained. So definitely put your sequences in a folder underneath your show folder when you're creating it. Now, there are a number of folders here that are created by Xlights. The backup folder is where Xlights puts all of its backups. You can see that I only have on start backups. So this is every time that I've run Xlights on this machine. I've only had it since Christmas, so it hasn't got that many. And so every time I start Xlights, it creates a backup of my my show folder. Color curves, this is a folder, it's empty here, but if I wanted to export any color curves, that's where they would generally be put. The palettes folder, if I was to save any palettes, that's where they would generally be put. The render cache folder is where the render cache is kept, and so you end up with these render cache folders for each sequence. Now, I don't think I have any actual, oh, sorry, there. Which one was it? Oh, there it is. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here is the render cache, and so you see there's all of these cached effects. And each file's not that large, but this all gets loaded into memory, so it can consume quite a bit of space, but it does speed up rendering significantly. That's the render cache. Value curves, if you export any value curves, this is where they go. And Xschedule data is created if you happen to be running Xschedule on your machine. This is where Xschedule stores some local data files like settings and the like. So yeah, they're the key folders around your show folders. Now, there is a feature in Xlights, in the tools menu, there is a cleanup file locations. So if you do have a sequence and you've referred to a bunch of files that are not inside your show folder, and you'd like to bring them underneath your show folder and you don't want to have to go and manually edit everything, that's what cleanup file locations is for. So what you would do is you would open up the sequencer, open up the sequence in the sequencer, then you'd go to Tool, Cleanup File Locations, and what that will do is it will go through the sequence looking at all the files that you're referencing, and it will copy those files, and it will create an audio folder and an images folder, etc. And it will bring all of those files and copy them into your show folder or into folders underneath your show folders. So it's a partial answer for how to fix up your files if you haven't been following the rule of putting all of your files underneath your show folder. It doesn't solve the problem of you putting the date inside your show folder name, but it will help you clean up your file locations and prevent issues going forward. Okay, so someone's asked a question about, well, how do I go and reload something from a backup? Look, at the end of the day, when you're ready to restore something from a backup, it's really just a matter of coming into here and copying the files from here back into your show folder or wherever it was that you wanted to restore it from. You can temporarily go in and load things out of the backup folder to see whether it's the right layout, etc. But you want to be really careful about that, because you're setting that backup folder to be your show folder. And we have come across people that have at some point in time in the past set their show folder to be one of their backup folders, and then they've proceeded to continue to make change in that show folder. And obviously you end up in a situation where no one's quite sure which files are the most current ones. But the way to restore from a backup is generally just to grab a copy of the file and bring it back into its original folder, and that's how you restore it. Now, you will see these X backup files. X backup files are actually the autosave files, and the backup on save, the backup process actually copies those as well. So this one here is obviously I was working on this 30-second animation, and this is the autosave for that 30-second animation. The _.x backup file. This file here is actually the autosave when I hadn't actually saved the sequence. So I hadn't given it a name. And so by default, it auto-saves it into this file here. You'll also notice your RGBFX file is auto-saved as well. So you may have experienced that situation where you start Xlights and it says, oh, the backup file seems to be newer. Well, what it's doing is it's looking at this X backup file and saying it's newer than the XML file and asking you whether you want to restore it. Now, the X backup files are basically exactly the same. Sorry, if I go back to here, if I open these two files up, right? So this is your RGBFX file. It's just an XML file. The X backup file is exactly the same. In fact, the only thing that seems to have changed here is a protocol and a port. So the X backup file is just the XML file with a different extension. So if you want to restore the X backup file manually, it's just a matter of renaming that file to be an XML file, and you can restore it from that. So that's show folders. We're okay to move on. Let's talk a little bit more on backups. There are some settings around here in terms of you can set where is it? All right, so we obviously have backup on launch and a backup on save. Like I said, a backup on save is like a double save in that it saves a second copy of everything. There is a backup location here somewhere. Oh. So if you select, so there is also a alternate backup. So you can have two backup locations. An alternate backup location would be something like, you know, maybe an SD card or a memory stick or something that you want to back up on. Thank you. And you can do an alternate backup. But yes, you can click on, that's right. So you can click on this subfolders thing here and you can specify both your backup location, but also your alternate backup directory, which is places where those backups will be stored. You can then at any time run an alternate backup or a backup just by pressing the F10 and F11 keys here, which will do an on-demand backup into those locations. So whatever you do, you should not rely on a single machine for a copy of your files. While the backup process in Xlights is useful and it's great to have everything backed up on your machine and have multiple copies of it, the reality is you're still dependent upon potentially a single drive or a single access to a machine. It may get lost or stolen, etc. And the amount of effort that goes into most people setting up their displays and setting up their sequences makes that loss so much greater. And so having a mechanism for ensuring that backups are made, that they're saved to a location other than your home location is key. I happen to use GitHub, but you know, it really doesn't matter. You can use a Dropbox, etc. You can set your alternate location to be a Dropbox and make sure that there's a copy of your key files inside those secondary locations. Is it possible to exclude specified extensions in the backup? So the backup only backs up the XML files and the X backup files. It does not back up media files, etc., etc. That would just create an insane size backup. It gets large enough as it is just by backing up the XML files. But all of your creative work sits inside those XML files. Okay, there's a small risk that by losing the media files, etc., you might have problems. But generally speaking, most of your media files, the audio files, etc., are replaceable. The things that's not replaceable is your actual creative work and your layout, etc. And so that's the stuff that we back up. It's also the stuff that, you know, if Xlights was to have conniptions and suddenly corrupt things, etc., that's the thing that you'd be most concerned about losing. Xlights is not going to corrupt your audio or your images, etc. And so we're a little less concerned about that. And look, this doesn't replace a general backup strategy for your home PC, which you should definitely be following. All right. Someone unmuted. I'll let someone kill that. All right. Let's talk about protocols. There are obviously a huge array of protocols here that Xlights supports. And, you know, it used to be that basically everyone used just the first two, right? USB, which they use for their Renards and Law controllers, and E131, which they use for everything else. Over the last couple of years, there's been an explosion in other protocols here. And so one of the things that people often struggle with is, well, which protocol should I be using? And that's changing over time, and I think it will change again this year as we continue to do work to try and simplify things. The simple thing is, obviously, the vast majority of Pixel controllers out there support E131, and E131 is still the go-to protocol for the vast majority of people. This top half of my display is very much old school, where every universe is broken out as a separate E131 line, even though it's all going to the same controller. But, you know, as you can see down here with my newer controllers, I've been moving towards the new way of doing things, which is really to put all of your universes into a single line item. So this here is 13 universes. This here is 20 universes of E131 for those controllers. You'll also see that, you know, I tend to hear I've gone up by 1,000 universes each controller. There's like 65,000 universes you can define in E131. There's no reason for me to try and pack them together densely. I just allocate a range of universes. And this way, if I suddenly find I need more universes for this controller, I'll just double click on it and increase the number of universes, and I'm done. This is by far, if you're going to go the E131 route, whether you allocate 1,000 or 100 universes or reserve 100 universes for each controller is fine, right? No controller I know does many more than 96 universes at any rate. But this is a great way of just organizing things. You just set the number to the number of universes you need. Don't set it exceptionally high. You get no prizes for pushing 96 universes of data to a Falcon controller that only uses 20 of them. You're much better off just pushing 20 universes. It will keep your network traffic lower and make your show more reliable. I often see people allocate 96 universes because the Falcon supports 96 universes. Well, if you're not going to use those 96 universes, you are just creating work. You're creating work for Xlights, you're creating work for your network, and you're creating work for the Falcon. You really don't need to do that. Allocate the number of universes that you need, and by doing it this way, adding those extra universes in if you suddenly find you need more is not a big deal, other than the fact that you need to go back and re-render your sequences because everything's moved around. So this is definitely the best way to do E131. Now, if your controllers happen to be Falcon PiPlayer, so you're going with something like the Culp controller, or you're running P10 panels, etc., off a BeagleBone or a Pi, and you're pushing the data over the network, you're not running it in remote mode, then you should probably be looking at something like the DDP controller, DDP protocol. The DDP protocol, I've got a couple of them here. These are actually really low level or low end Arduino controllers. I use DDP because it's very, very network efficient. But here you just specify the number of channels, and it's, like I say, it's extremely network efficient. If you're running a P10 panel using DDP, you can run a much larger panel over the network with no lag than if you were using E131, and that's just the efficiency, the inherent efficiency of the protocol. Now, if you're running a P10 panel on a controller, but you don't want to push the data over the network, you just want to use one of the remote protocol, the remote protocol synchronization, you want the controller to actually read the data locally out of a file, then I would generally use the add null to represent the channels for that P10 or P5 panel. And by adding a null, that means that basically X-Lights and obviously any show player that you have won't be pushing the data over the network because you don't want to be doing that. And of course, finally, obviously, if you're using Light-O-Rama, these days I would be using this add law. The add law allows you to add it's a much more advanced version of the law protocol than the one that's supported by the add USB. This add USB law controller, look, you can run about 96 channels of it before it starts to really have issues. The add law enables you to run a few more. In fact, you can even run some of the PXE controllers up to a point. You'll invariably run into lag if you try to run too much over the law protocol. It's definitely not as efficient as the law software itself in running law controllers, but Gil's done a pretty good job of reverse engineering a fair bit of the protocol, and this is much, much more efficient than the old Light-O-Rama was under the add USB. And then, of course, there's the ZCPP protocol. ZCPP protocol is basically, it's a bit of a hybrid between, it's very similar to DDP in terms of its efficiency. It's slightly less efficient. There's like 4 bytes less data in a ZCPP packet than there is in a DDP packet. But ZCPP offers you the power of configuring controllers that support it dynamically. So it gets rid of the whole process of uploading to controller and to configure the controller every time you change it. And when you're, particularly when you're in that sort of setup mode, etc., ZCPP can be a lot easier to use. The downside of ZCPP right now is that FPP doesn't support it, which is unfortunate. But who knows what might happen this year. But ZCPP basically, it basically automates a whole bunch of things. The other thing that was introduced with ZCPP, which has been progressively made available in DDP and E131, but only when you use these sort of block allocations of E131, is, and you'll see it here, is this auto start channels. And what that allows X-Lights to do is basically you give up control over setting the start channels on your various props, and instead you start to use a mechanism where, let's pick a prop. Instead of using this start channel, what you do is you go, I haven't got any set up at the moment, but if I was to come back to here and say, use auto start channels. Now I can come in here and I can actually pick my controller that I want to put that prop onto, and I just set the port and the protocol, etc. And now X-Lights will take care of working out exactly whereabouts how exactly that prop should be configured onto that controller. Now, the downside of this is every time you change something, these things can get shuffled around. And the challenge you run into there is you have to keep remembering that you have to upload the configuration to the controller every time it changes. And it's not always as immediately obvious that that's happened. With ZCPP, of course, the difference is as long as you've got output to lights turned on, it's actually automatically reconfiguring the controller as you change things. In fact, it'll even light the prop up to show you that it's been configured. That's the power of ZCPP. Becomes a little less significant once you get into show player mode. The power of ZCPP in show player mode is that it you can swap controllers out and have those controllers automatically configured as well, but it's a fairly rare scenario and therefore the benefit's not as great. For those people that are going the E131 route and are struggling with the concept of, well, what is this universe thing and what does it mean? One of the very first Existential videos was this one here. Hopefully it's not going to play. No, it's not. RGB Basics and Setup Tab Part 2. And this one, this section here, I think was actually presented by JD. JD uses a stadium analogy to explain what universes are and channels are, etc. This video is the best explanation of universes and channels that I've ever seen attempt. I've seen a number of attempts, including a number of mine, and none of them even come close to the clarity that I thought JD brought to the scenario. So rather than trying to explain it all again here, I'd recommend that you go and find this RGB Basics and Setup Tab video on the X-Lights video site. It's an awesome video. It's I can't remember how far in. It's a little bit into it. It's obviously part 2. It was quite a long session, but definitely worth watching. All right, moving on again. I wanted to talk a little bit about building your props. Every year we see people run into situations where they build their prop and then they go to define it in X-Lights and they struggle with it. And typically they struggle with it because X-Lights makes a whole bunch of assumptions about the sorts of wiring patterns that you support. And this is particularly true, not so much with the custom model, but with some of these other model types. And not all of them have the issue, but you know, let's take the megatree or the tree. There are lots of different ways that you can wire up a tree, but X-Lights only supports a certain number of them. So for instance, you know, X-Lights assumes if you built a 360 tree that the first strand of the tree is at the back, not at the front, not at the side. It's always at the back. Now this seems blind Freddy obvious if you do a 180 tree, right? Obviously the first strand's going to be here either on the left side or the right side. But with a 360 tree, it's a little bit less obvious. But you know, effectively can think about the tree wrapping all the way around to the back. It's still going to assume that the beginning is at the back on the left or the right. Now it can be the left or the right. It can go either way. That's where the bottom left and bottom right. If it's bottom left, then the first strand's going to be here and it's going to come around, if you're looking down on the tree, anti-clockwise. And if it was bottom right, then it's going to start still at the back, but instead it's going to come clockwise around the tree. But you can see there's only a handful of locations. It can either be at the top or be at the bottom. It's most commonly at the bottom, and it's left or right. The other thing that it assumes in the tree is that if you're going to have multiple connections back to your controller or multiple strings of lights that make up your tree, we assume that every string of lights is the same length. So we don't create 2 strings of 400 and 1 of 200, right? That is not supported by the tree model and will cause you issues when you go to model it in X-Lights. In X-Lights, and particularly when it comes time to upload to the controller, this property here called the number of strings is generally viewed as the number of connections that you have back to your controller data ports, right? In fact, if I come down here and I set this on port 1 of my controller, and I bring these in, right, you can see that when I chose to use 4 strings on my controller here, it's now using ports 1 to 4. If I change this to be 8, it's now saying I'm going to be using ports 1 to 8 on my controller. Right, so this number here is typically viewed as being the number of data connections I have back to my controller. Now, if these are 50 pixels up, but I want to have 4 of them on each string, I just have to come down here and make this 200 and then set my strands to string to 4, and my tree goes back to looking like it did before. But now what I've said here is I've got 4 strings, which means there's 4 strings of lights. Each string of lights is 200 pixels long, but each string goes up and down 4 times, right, before it then goes on to the next string. Right, that's how Xlights models it. The problem is if you've gone and built this as 2 strings of 200 and then, 2 strings of 400, then 1 string of 200, there is no way to set the model properties here to represent your tree. And so there is no easy way to use the tree model. Now you've got to go and create a custom model. The custom model doesn't look as pretty. It won't necessarily, you can still make it render the same, but you're going to have issues. You may not be able to upload it to your controller. You may have to, define it. There are ways to define it still here, but you will never be able to upload it to your controller. You will have to go and manually configure your controller, and that's fine. It's not hard to do. It's just something that most people are trying to move away with because of the ease of setting things up if you can just push configurations to your controller. And things like ZCPP and the like are all assuming that you are going to be pushing your configuration to your controller. So it starts to limit your options when you start moving away from the models that are supported in Xlights. It's a similar thing with the matrix. The matrix also assumes that each string of lights is the same length. So, 18 lines of lights spread across 3 data ports is fine. That's 6 lines per data port. Everything's good. But if you end up with 1 string that's a slightly different length, or you decide that, I ran out of pixels at this point in the middle of the tree, and so I just started the next line of pixels from here and ran the data line back to my controller, that's not a good thing. That's not something that the standard matrix model is going to support. In Xlights, you're going to have to move towards a custom model. Fortunately, with a matrix, it's a little bit easier to do a custom model of a matrix than it is of a tree, but still not advisable. And the custom model does run slower in Xlights. It's not as efficient as one of these built-in model types. The same with the star, right? With the star, the start points for the star are only a couple of locations, right? You can either do it at the top here or at the bottom here in the crotch of the star. You can't start it here at the bottom of the leg, right? It doesn't work. The built-in model only gives you 2 possible start points. So you want to be sure that you're wiring up your star using one of those start points. Otherwise, you're going to have to move again to a custom model. So take the time to understand what the model options are available to you. Definitely plan for power injection. I know some people are scared of power injection and don't want to do it. But even when you think everything's good, you can often find yourself in situations where you need power injection. I know some people like to run their props at very low power and avoid the situation. Power injection is not that hard to do. There are a number of really good presentations on power injection. It's not something to be scared of. It's a relatively easy thing to do, and you should always be planning for it. If you do end up going the custom model route, look, there are a couple of things that you can do here. Obviously, if you're downloading a model, you'll get the custom model all done for you. If you do go the download route, and you grab a model like this soldier, right? It's got a decent number of pixels on it. Please do take advantage of the wiring view to understand how it has been wired. And please note that this is generally the reverse view. If you want the front view, that's okay. You just need to tell it that you want the front view. And then follow the wiring carefully. If you screw up, you can edit it. So you can come over to the model data here and click edit. And let's say that you did wire it incorrectly, that you wired it backwards. You can come here and right click and do a horizontal flip, which would be exactly the same as I push the pixels as if I was looking at it from the front when it was looking at it from the back, etc. So you can flip everything around reasonably easily. You can also see the wiring view here. So you note that you can come in here and have a quick look at the wiring view and edit your model data. Now, if you wanted to wire this up, so this has got 150 pixels. Let's say you did want to have 2 connections to the controller. You can do that. Yeah. You can do that. You can come down into Xlights and say that there are actually 2 strings of lights here. And then you can go in and say that I'm going to have individual start nodes, and I can say that the second string of lights starts at pixel 100. So my first string of lights will be 1 to 100, 1 to 99. Well, actually, let's make it 101. So 1 to 100, and then I'm going to have a second string that starts at 101 and goes through to 150. And so you can have unbalanced string lengths in here using the custom model. And so that's why it's you know, you can use a custom model if you go and wire a matrix up kind of weird. The disadvantage with a tree obviously is while you can definitely create a custom model to represent a tree, it's not going to look like a tree. It's going to look more like a vertical matrix. Just as a result of the issues. And you're probably going to want that for rendering reasons as well. But yeah, the custom model gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you define your controller. And if I come down here and put that, I don't know, on port 4, you can see here that it's going to be using up ports 4 and 5 on that controller. And yeah. The other thing that you should definitely be taking advantage of, and this is probably all screwed up here, is the visualizer. For those that have never come in and looked at the visualizer, this is a great way to understand how are my pixels laid out on my controller. So you can see here, this happens to be an F4. I have a face, I have string tree 1. I have no idea why my layout's now all screwed out, but you know, my driveway arches, they're split across 2 ports. I have all my mini trees chained together, and then I have my faces. This one here is something that I've been playing with. So the visualizer gives you the ability to go in and understand exactly how Xlights, after you've done all your modeling in here, how it actually, how it would look on your controller if you were going to upload it to your controller. If you do go and build a prop and you want to generate a custom model from it, generating custom models is a bit of a lost art these days, with so many people just able to download their custom models either directly in Xlights or via their vendors' websites. People have kind of lost the art of building custom models a little bit. Obviously, you do have the ability to edit it via the model data. And it's possible to bring an image in and then trace out the image and mark out where all your pixels are. The other one that you can use is there is this Generate Custom Model tab here, and this allows you to go in and if you've got your prop built and you've got your lights on it, you've got it all plugged into a controller, you can actually generate a data pattern. So this screen here, and there's a video that shows you how to do this. You basically tell it to light up your prop, you run the capture pattern, you video it, and then once you've got the video, you bring the video back in, you go to the process tab and you load the video up here, and it will, Xlights will watch the video and map out whereabouts the pixels are in space. The process is a little slow. I plan on improving this, get this down from minutes to seconds to make this a lot better, but that can generate your custom model. These custom models here of my baubles here, these were all generated using the video So basically, I didn't map out where these pixels were. I have no idea where they were. I just made a video and let Xlights watch the video, and that generated me this custom model. And then when I throw an effect on using a per preview, it works exactly as every pixel lights up exactly when it should. It comes up pretty good. So that's custom models. We talked about multi-string. We talk about flip and rotate. Definitely do take a look at if your model data is screwed up in some way. Definitely do take a look at the tools here, the right-click tools here. There's a whole bunch of tools here for moving nodes around and rotating them. If you do need to rotate a model, this particularly happens with snowflakes. So let's say you've got a snowflake here. And let's say I need to rotate my snowflake because I got it wrong. Oh, that's hard to see. You can come in here and rotate the model. You can rotate it 90, you can do that very easily, but you can also rotate it by a given number of degrees. So let's say I was out by 30 degrees, I can do this. The only thing I would flag to you is that you don't want to be doing that multiple times. If you rotate it by 30 and then you say, you know what, that's not quite right, I suggest you cancel it and go back and reload it again and try and rotate it again, because the rotate, it kind of accumulates errors is probably the best way to describe things. If I rotate this, I don't know, let's do this. Let's try rotate it by 10 degrees, then we'll rotate it by 10 degrees again. All right, and we'll rotate it by 10 degrees again. You can see that it's starting to get a bit messy. In places, things are starting to get a bit out of line, and that's just a result of that cumulative rotation by an angle. So generally I would avoid doing that. It will cause you problems over time. Okay. All right, where else did we want to go? Did I mention that friends don't let friends buy strip? I love strip. All of my house outline, etc., is in strip. It looks amazing. My tree's in strip. But strip is not for the faint of heart. You've got to have a certain amount of confidence in dealing with repair a strip, because for every person that tells you that their strip is perfect, they've had it for years and they've never had a problem with it, I can find you another 10 people that have thrown the thing in the can at the end of the year as being just a nightmare to deal with. Strip is inherently fragile. It does not cope well with heat in our summer heat. The 50/50 LEDs have been known to separate from the substrate and the strip can break. And water ingress is a problem with strip. Particularly if you don't apply additional sealant to the strip that you receive from China. It will leak in wet weather. It also doesn't like being placed onto anything that's flexible. Any stress, particularly stretching stress, will have a tendency to break joints. Any flexing will have a tendency to, again, encourage the 50/50 LEDs to separate. So look, as much as I love how it looks, it is going to be problematic, and unless you're very comfortable with repairing strip, you're probably not going to want to go that way. You will have a lot less issues with either pixels or the modules or other ways. And you can actually achieve a strip-like look with modules, but it's quite an expensive thing to do. What I do love about strip is the density that you get. You can get much better looking lines with much greater continuity of color with strip than you can with nodes, but it comes with a lot of pain. Is there a dense bullet square pixel that mimics the density of strips? No, the closest you're going to get is modules. You can buy the 3 LED single 2811 modules and put them pretty close together. They're much more waterproof. It's quite an expensive way to buy lights though. But yeah, nodes, you're going to be drilling a lot of holes. Look, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about controllers. These are my views on controllers. Look, we are spoilt for choice for controllers. It used to be that there were relatively few Pixel controllers available. They were all very expensive. They often came with some pretty significant limitations around pixel counts, etc. And these days, a lot of those things are no longer true. There are some real options out there around Pixel controllers. There are very few Pixel controllers that I would tell you to absolutely avoid. The only ones that I would tell you to absolutely avoid is I would avoid buying Pixel controllers off AliExpress out of China. While those things will run pixels, a lot of them are not E131 controllable. So they'll run pixels, but they're generally designed to run a standalone sort of prop. So any of the T1000 series of controllers, etc., avoid those things like the plague. I would also avoid the E131 controllers out of China. They tend to be relatively expensive and definitely not as configurable and not as capable in the hobby, and you will not find others that are using them, and so you'll struggle with them. I would also avoid any controllers that run pixels over the RS485 protocol or the LoR protocol, just because of speed and capacity limitations. While LoR achieves a lot with their Pixie controllers over the LoR protocol, the reality is that while we can run those Pixie controllers, you are going to have lag issues and problems with them. And I would generally recommend people get rid of their Pixie controllers if they're going to move to X-Lights. You might get away with a Pixie 4 or an 8, but the Pixie 16, unless you're only going to run a handful of pixels off each output, you're going to have lag issues, and there's no getting away from it. So I would avoid those sorts of controllers. Controllers that I would seriously reconsider, I started, in fact, I still have a number of Arduino controllers that I use to run some of my dumb lights, etc. That's a hard road to go down. And I would, generally speaking, suggest that people avoid that unless they really are people that are very familiar with that technology and are very comfortable with tinkering, and what they enjoy is actually solving those problems and getting those things to work. The reality is while the Arduino hardware, etc., is just wonderfully cheap and tempting, the reality is that it's an extremely frustrating way to set up a show, and you will regret it. Within the year, you'll be frustrated and going back and looking at other options. I'd also suggest that people seriously reconsider the ESP type controllers, the Pixel Sticks and the like. There are absolutely certain scenarios where they are a great solution, but the cheapness of them, etc., leads people to think that they're going to create large displays based on them. And again, it's like strip, right? For everyone who'll tell you that they run 20 of these things and they're wonderful and their show runs perfectly, I'm going to go and find another 20 people that will tell you that they used them and then they threw them out because they were frustrating and they had lag issues, and it ran well one day and then it ran poorly the next day. And the reality is they are a source of enormous frustration if you're going to go at any scale. Now, if you're just going to run a single prop and you're going to run a couple of hundred pixels, etc., on it, look, it will work. But the problem is where you've got 30 people standing outside your house, all with noisy smartphones polluting the Wi-Fi spectrum, and you've got those controllers spread all over your yard, which means some of them are not necessarily getting a great Wi-Fi signal. You are going to have issues with them. They are going to cause frustration. So yeah, I would generally not suggest people go that way. In terms of the FPP-based controllers, they're pretty good. They can be another cheap way. I generally wouldn't recommend pi caps and the like. They can be a great way to start out and play with pixel control, but only having a couple of outputs of pixels, I actually don't know that it's necessarily a great economic proposition. The capes on things like the BeagleBone, etc., are obviously a very cheap way to get a lot of pixels under control. They do have the disadvantage of relying on FPP and just the complexity of FPP. It's not the simplest of controllers to use, but there's an enormous amount of support for FPP. It's not like you're going to lack for people that know how to help you get that set up and running. But the FPP firmware is, or the FPP software is more complex than most of the pixel controllers, and it's going to require a fair bit more maintenance on your behalf to run with. So there's a trade-off there. You get a lot of pixels for relatively little cost. The boards have improved dramatically as a result of some of the work that Dan has been doing in terms of his hardware design, etc. And so they do represent a reasonable option. They're just higher maintenance than some of the other pixel controllers. In terms of the more dedicated pixel controllers, look, the Falcon is the probably the bee's knees in terms of definitely support out of X-Lights, etc., and capability. Like I say, FPP, the FPP-based controllers, I would put as a close second, and mainly because of that complexity. In terms of capability, they are pretty much equally capable, and in many ways, obviously with the ability to run panels and everything else, the FPP is more capable, and definitely more capable as a show player. And so if you're after a controller, show player, all in one, etc., it's hard to go past FPP for that capability. Then you get into things like the PixLights and the like. We support them really well. The Lukes from Advatech shared the specs with us so that we could do the uploads to it. So you get pretty good support for the PixLights, and consequently the Pixicons, which is really just a rebadged PixLight controller. So they are robust controllers, well supported. The SanDevices stuff is pretty good. The SanDevices stuff has a few limitations. But they're very robust controllers. They've been around a long time. Again, there's a lot of people in the hobby that have used them for a long time, so they are well supported. And then you get to things like the J1 Sys boards and the Holiday Coro boards. The J1 Sys boards suffer based on age and support. No one's buying J1 Sys boards anymore, but they're still there. The Holiday Coro boards are more common and more current. The support in X-Lights is a bit new, and consequently there's probably a few issues with it, which I'm sure will get shaken out over time. And look, the Holiday Coro boards, depending on which board, different limitations, etc. But they're quite capable pixel controllers that will run your lights. That's kind of my view around controllers. Definitely. The other debate that people often have is, well, should I be buying an F16 or should I be buying an F48? There are definitely scenarios where the F48 is a great option. I generally would recommend for most people an F16 over an F48, just because with an F16 you can always throw in the expansion boards and get the remotes, etc. And most people will have some prop that requires a certain amount of density of ports, and therefore putting the controller near that dense prop means you get those ports, but you can also get the remotes as well. But your mileage may vary. You definitely need to read up and understand the constraints and limitations around things like the F48. People think that, well, I get 48 outputs at 1,000 pixels. You don't. An F48 requires a large amount of very careful planning of your prop designs to ensure that you manage the balance of the balance of pixels across the various ports. If you don't do that carefully, you can find yourself really ending up with an F16 again, because you don't, because the remotes effectively, if you don't balance things correctly, you can find that you'll consume all of your pixels per port on just 4 of those remote receiver boards, rather than being able to take advantage of all 12 of them. So that's controllers. Moving on. Show network design. Lots of issues through the season in terms of people setting up networks. Networks, I guess, are not the most intuitive things for most people. And if you add in the complexity of having multiple networks and bridging and everything else, it does get very confusing. There are some really good Existential videos that will go through network design and how to set up networks. And I have no doubt there'll be additional ones this year. Generally speaking, you're going to want to keep your network off your home network. If you're running anything more than 20 or 30 universes or equivalent, you're not going to want to be running that on your home network, particularly if that traffic's going over Wi-Fi. That's really going to annoy those other members of your household and cause issues. You're going to want to generally go wired. If you must go wireless, you're definitely going to want to be looking to go with the master remote type setups, using FPP type controllers or FPPs associated with your Falcons, etc. Just to, or the Falcons themselves in that remote mode, just to minimize the amount of network traffic that's going over Wi-Fi. What works in your workshop doesn't always work in your show in real time, so you're definitely going to want to consider that. But yeah, keep your show network separate. Keep it wired if you can. If you must go Wi-Fi, then use a master remote setup so that you're not sending all of the pixel data over that Wi-Fi network, but you're just sending a handful of sync packets, and it will work reasonably well. I think the final thing that I wanted to on my list, and I'll open it up for questions and people can ask away. I did want to talk about FPP and Xschedule a little bit, just in terms of how they're the same and where they're different. I think there's probably, it's hard to judge, but I definitely think that more people probably run their shows on FPP. There is some real attraction to FPP as a show player. If nothing else, just the fact that it is a small, cheap computer that you can put anywhere in any box, etc., does make it an attractive way to play your show. The ability to run lights directly off it, if necessary, and therefore, particularly on a smaller show, the ability to have everything on one device, etc., is quite attractive. They are small, they're relatively cheap. While they're not hugely powerful, although that's less and less the case as new versions go up, they are a bit fiddly to set up. I think it's fair to say that through the setup season, a significant proportion of the setup issues were people trying to work out and understand how to set their FPP up and get their show running. But once you get your head around it, it's not that bad. Gone are the days when FPP was quite unstable and you had to reinstall it frequently and it would corrupt the file system. Those things are largely not true anymore. It's an extremely, once you've got it set up and running, etc., it's very stable. You do need to keep it up to date. Dan has a tendency of removing support for older versions of it pretty aggressively, so you are going to need to update it, but fortunately you don't need to update it with every release of FPP unless you're experiencing the issues that Dan's fixing. You don't have to be rushing in fixes, but you will want to be updating before you go into next year, etc. It doesn't tend to support old versions very well. And it is very popular. In terms of Xschedule, obviously Xschedule requires APC. For many people, that's not such an issue. Most people have an old laptop floating around. I do run Xschedule these days on a laptop. The laptop is more than 10 years old. It does run Windows 10, and it runs Xschedule just fine. The upside to it is more tightly bound to Xlite. So if I can get my lights working correctly out of Xlights, setting up Xschedule to run those lights is literally a 3-minute job. I can get my schedule up and running, and everything just works. If I fix something in Xlights, it's immediately available in Xschedule. I might have to do a restart, but other than that, everything just works. It's in terms of actual capabilities, will it run my show the same way? For 99 or 90% of shows, you can do everything that you want to do on either of them, in terms of scheduling, playing stuff. You will run into the occasional difference in terms of scheduling capability or integration capabilities, but even those have, disappeared over time. I think a year ago, Xschedule was probably a bit in front when it came to those things. I know Dan's worked very hard on improving the scheduler and the API support in FPP, which has closed the gap, and no doubt in some areas gone ahead. I don't know. I don't keep that close a track on it. But yeah, it definitely, those sorts of things have closed the gap. And so a lot of the time it's going to come down to convenience, what hardware you have available, whereabouts you need to put that hardware to run your show, etc., that will help you make a decision about which one works for you. A lot of people, have both. They set one up as the backup for another. They set their show up on FPP, but they have Xschedule there just in case, or they do the reverse. Many people who run Xschedule use FPP as well. They'll be running their P5 panels off an FPP instance, but they'll be running Xschedule as their show player. And they work quite well together in terms of sharing, working as master remotes, etc. So yeah, for the vast majority of people, it's a choice that you will make based on factors often independent of the actual capabilities or features of the two things. It really comes down to what I have available. So I understand that's a bit of a whirlwind tour. I think I covered all the topics I promised that I would cover. I'm happy to cover other things if people would like me to. It definitely wasn't a beginner one, although I have tried to slant things towards people that are maybe relatively new and coming into this and trying to make head or tail of it. Definitely download that 101 manual from the ACL website and read it. It is your best starting point introduction, and then delve into the videos and start watching away. So any questions? Feel free to unmute or write in chat. Oh, yeah, there's a question I missed here. What protocols do the Culp controllers use? The Culp controllers use two protocols. They use E131. Or DDP. DDP is obviously more efficient, and if you're going to be running large numbers of pixels, etc., you definitely want to consider DDP.
I know that you aren't exactly the person for Xscheduler, but I was wondering what the difference whenever you click on the light bulb to export. I was wondering what the difference between the green light bulb and the green light bulb with that little brown looking thing next to it was, or if there was a difference.
There is. Okay, so this is a multi-state button, and it kind of tells you down here, right? So when the gear is there, it's in auto mode, right? And so what that means is and I don't want to press play because it's going to kill my network in some nasty way. But when the gear is there, if I play a playlist, the light bulb will automatically turn green. So the gear is like auto mode.
Oh, okay.
Right. Whereas if it's just red, that means it's off and it's not in auto mode. So if you play a playlist, nothing will get sent out. Okay, and then green without the gear means that output to lights is on and it's always on. So even when there's no playlist playing, it's still pumping out data. And then when it's green with the gear, that means that it's currently pumping out data, but the gear means that if you stop the playlist, it would actually go back to the red with the gear.
Oh, okay.
So generally speaking, I would leave it just with the gear because that's automatic. It will turn on and off on its own.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
How to create text on a prop. Example, have joy on a mega tree. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so here's my mega tree. So obviously, now there's two ways to do this, right? There's this joy on a mega tree. Do you want to do it as an effect, or do you want to actually redefine the prop as if it was a joy prop and then be able to sequence the joy? Because both are actually possible. Putting joy onto a prop, if I can find my mega tree. Tell how arch tree, there it is. That's really as simple as putting a text effect on it, putting the word joy, like that. That's as simple as it is to put text. All right, okay, that's how you would do it. All right, and you can have each letter the different color, or you can just have them all the same color. It's up to you. What about using ESP8266 MCU as a controller, Carl asks. Look, that's in the same category as all the other ESPs. Generally, I would recommend against it, except in some very limited scenarios. You will run into issues as you try to scale it. If you're running one of them, yeah, not such a big deal. It'll work. Don't run too many pixels on it. It'll be pretty okay. But they don't scale. They run into issues. They have reliability issues. When your yard's full of people and everyone's got a phone in their pocket that's blaring out on the Wi-Fi spectrum, you'll get connectivity issues or speed issues, etc. It's not great. They're great to play with, but I would never run a Christmas light display with any more than a handful of them. But look, if you've got one prop, I don't know, you've got one prop that's, in the far corner of the yard or something, or it's really difficult to get to, etc., and you really need a Wi-Fi. It's got 100 pixels on it. Sure, that's not that hard. You could work that. Just don't overdo it. How do you create a wave effect with a yard full of piece stakes? Randomly laid out, or laid out as like a cube, regularly laid out, because it varies. But in a grid, in a grid's easy. In fact, I made a video on that. I don't even need to show it to you. If I go to my YouTube channel, go to all my videos, a waving 3D flag. I didn't share my audio, but yeah, this has a, was that something what you were after? I mean, maybe you don't want a flag, but yeah. All right, well, that video, if you go through that video, I think, pretty sure, yeah, I do. I go through and show you the settings that I use to set it up and get it going. So go find my YouTube channel and find that video. Stop. Cancel. You can unmute your microphone, guys. Like, you can talk to me. What's the best way to copy a few effects from one model and paste on another model and have it start at the same time? So, look, this is where timing marks are definitely your friend. If you want things to start at the same time, timing marks are your friend for a number of reasons, but lining up a timing mark, things, if you set it, there's an option up here, snap to timing marks. You definitely probably want to have that turned on, and that means when you're dragging this thing and you get close to a timing mark, it snaps onto it. But you can also do things like use control right arrow, control left arrow to jump between timing marks. You can also control shift and it will stretch it out to the timing mark. So there's a bunch of keyboard shortcuts that will also help you do that sort of thing. Also, you may want to spend some time playing with these two icons up here, paste by time and paste by cell. So those things, so here, for instance, I've got two cells that are different sizes. If I go to post by cell mode and I copy this thing and I paste it here, you'll notice that the length of this, which is 7.869, is different to this one, which is 6.65. And that's because I'm in paste for cell mode. So it's worked out the percentage of this cell that was filled up. And when I pasted here, it expanded it out to be the same proportion of the cell. Whereas paste by time, if I paste this one, cut and paste this one by time, you can see that it's the same length. Right, so paste by cell and time also give you a lot of control as well. Can you delete a timing mark? Absolutely you can. You just come up here and you click on the timing mark and you press the delete key and it deletes. So yes, you can delete timing marks as much as you like. Also, if you want to, the other thing to understand is that when timing marks aren't active, right, so there's no timing marks active now, you get this yellow box selection mode, which you don't get if this is active. When these cells are active, it wants to act like it's a spreadsheet. When there's no timing marks active, then it acts more freeform. And so you can do more freeform selection. So I can come up here and select all of those and press the delete key to delete them. Do I have video on timing marks and how to set them? Not a separate video. It's definitely been covered in a number of videos. I would definitely be looking at some of the musical videos. If you go to the Existentials sequence videos, have a look at, I think Tom Beck George has done ones around sequencing and talked about timing marks. There was a guy out of Florida, I don't remember his name, but he did one as well where he spent a fair bit of time talking about how he generates timing marks, etc. And obviously there is always the Vamp plugins, which are a great way of at least getting a beginning set of timing marks for a song. Can I go over importing a purchase sequence best practices? I can. Importing a sequence is, look, the key thing with importing a sequence, and look, I'm not going to go and do it. There are videos out there, and one of my most popular videos is importing an X-Lite sequence. So definitely go and watch this video right here. The thing about importing a sequence, so there's a couple of things. So the first one and the most important one is when you get your sequence, put it into a folder that's underneath your show folder, right? Because only by doing that can you guarantee that all your images, etc., are going to come in properly, etc., and be linked correctly and stay linked correctly as you move from machine to machine over time, etc. So definitely do that. I would then generally create a folder either per song or per vendor and create subfolders per song underneath it. When you do it, the first thing that you want to do when you've got someone's sequence is you want to go to the Setup tab and click on the show directory and change the show directory. Go into that imported folder. I don't know, let's go to this one here. Yep. All right, and so we go into, this is a PPD one. So we go into their layout. And so you load their layout up and then you open up the sequence. Now, in this case, this hasn't come with the media file. I'm just going to make it an animation and bring their sequence in. Now, we generally recommend that you do a render, okay? Technically, do you need to do a render? Probably not, but you're going to want to watch it, so you may as well render it. So you would do a render all. The most important thing that you do, and this is the thing that so many people that do these videos forget, and is the most critical thing that you are going to do, and that is you're going to click the save icon and save the sequence. Now that seems insane. Well, hang on a second, I just bought this sequence. Why am I saving it? Well, the reason you're saving it is when Xlights opened this sequence up inside their show folder, what it did was it went through and worked out where all of the image files were. And because they were all underneath their show folder, it fixed up all the paths and made them correct on your machine. But the problem is all of those fix-ups exist in memory. And so by clicking the save icon here, what it's going to do is it's going to save all of those image paths, video paths, shader paths, etc., into the XML file on your machine, and they're going to be correct for your machine. And what that means is when it comes time for you to import the sequence into your display, all of those image paths and video paths and shader paths and everything else are all going to be correct and valid on your machine. And so you won't have to be running around trying to work out, well, where did that video go? Why can't I do that? Etc., etc. So the most critical thing that you must do is change to their setup, load the sequence, and click the save icon. And if you do that, 90% of the importing problems that you might experience go away. Okay? Now, when it comes time to actually do the import, you'll obviously need to go back to your show folder. You'll want to create a new sequence. You'll obviously want to create the new sequence. You typically make it a musical sequence pointing to the song file that you've purchased. And now you want to do the import. And here you do the import effects. Now, if you're importing things from the same vendor over and over again, you're going to have a layout, a mapping file that you'll have, and so you'll load that mapping file for that particular vendor. Now, generally, given these guys use the same layout in every sequence, you'd probably want to just keep reusing that mapping. You don't need to map everything. You don't have to use everything out of their sequence. I don't have any spinners. I got some snowflakes that look like spinners, but you don't have to bring everything in. You choose the things that you think you need to, and you don't have to bring them all in one hit. You can bring some in sometimes, some in later. You'd almost always want to bring in all of the timing marks, and then just map in the things that make sense to you, and click OK. And it will bring all the effects in. You obviously then need to do a render all, because until you render all, none of these effects have actually got anything on it. And you can see that if you go down. If you go down here and look at this star, if I open it up, you can see at the nodes there's no data here, whereas if I click on this thing, it will render it, and you can see all the data started to get populated. Well, you can click render all to populate all of that data. Do I need to cover more, or is that good enough? Most important thing is, remember, switch to their show folder, open the sequence, and save it.
If you're done with that question, I have one more. So I have a lot of AC lights. I used X-Lights this last year. I had no idea that there was an AC toolbar.
There is.
But I went into Sequencer, and it's not working like the drag and drop. So what am I doing wrong?
That's right. It doesn't work like drag and drop. It's actually modeled to work more close to classic AC light sequences like Vixen 2 and Law. So it works on a much more of a cell-based mechanism. So
do you have to have timing marks?
Yeah, you do. So most people that use those sort of AC sequences would typically go and create a timing track. And they would either typically create one that is at the lowest, this is 50 milliseconds, so they create a 50 millisecond, or you might go and use the metronome and maybe create, I don't know, a half-second timing track like so, right? And then when you turn on AC mode, right, and you say, look, I want on, right, now you can just come over and just drag and drop things, or you can set ramps.
Got it.
Right, and there's keyboard shortcuts for all of this, etc. And you can just you can move around with the mouse, the keyboard and everything, and yeah.
All right, that'll make next year easier.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. But yeah, you can put it in select mode. You can come around. You can say, look, I'll put an on effect there, a ramp down, ramp up, and so forth. And you can hold the shift key, ramp up, right? So it's a very different way of sequencing. But for people that are used to, Lightorama and doing AC type props, this is the kind of sequencing that you do. There's a video, would you believe? Hard to believe, I know, but there is a video. If I go back to, again, my videos, you have to go back a little bit because AC mode's been around for a while. I can't see it. There's definitely one here. We'll go back to X-Lights videos, type AC. Sequencing AC channels in X-Lights. That's one of Clyde Lindsay's videos. There's another one I did as well. I don't know. Yeah, a new way to sequence AC lights. This was the release video when we introduced the feature.
Okay. Thank you.
Do I have a list of keyboard shortcuts available? Oh, actually, my mouse mat has them all on it. Actually, it doesn't have all of them. It has a lot of them. Keyboard shortcuts. You go to the help menu and go down to key bindings. There's a list of shortcuts. I don't know if that's what you meant, but yeah. And there's also a bunch of other keyboard shortcuts that you can add by editing the key bindings file. Again, there are videos available that talk about that as well. I have a 4K resolution laptop, and the sequence screen where the models are on the left, that whole area is really small, and it's not like that before I updated to 2020.1. Can you explain or see why it's doing that? I can't, because I don't have a 4K monitor. So I know Dan's been playing with fixing some of the problems with some of those high DPI monitors. So there's a bunch of fixes. There may be additional fixes. This may actually include additional fixes that you don't have. In fact, I'm pretty sure it does. So there may be fixes coming in the next couple of releases for it. We changed our entire tool chain this year because of issues that we were facing with the old one last year, and consequently some issues have re-emerged around HDPI. But yeah, you can buy me a 4K laptop and I'll see what happens. If I don't see the problem, it's hard for me to work on it. Any more questions? In the X schedule with the SMS plugin, I was not able to block cell numbers, though the checkbox option was there. What am I missing? That's a good question. What are you missing? Right. So there is an option to use a phone blacklist. The thing is, you need to edit the phone blacklist. And the phone
where is that file? Where is the phone blacklist file?
From memory, it's in
program
files,
along with the whitelist and the blacklist.
I don't remember. I have to go look it up. I can have a look at. Let's go have a look.
Were you looking for the text file?
The text file that would allow you to edit to block somebody's phone number. There it is.
Phone blacklist.txt.
Is it just?
Maybe I didn't include it in the release file, but that's what it's called. I'll have to go and have a look and add that back into the list.
All right, cool.
All right. What else have we got? Any other questions? We're all done. Also, all right. Well, look, guys, I hope you got something out of that. I realised that was a real grab bag of things. I've barely scratched the surface. There's obviously a huge amount in Xlight, in the scheduler, and in the other associated tools. If you would like in-depth training or more training, watch the videos. Join us at Expo. Come to the 2-day class before Expo. I can guarantee that you will leave with a head full of ideas and a much deeper understanding of how Xlight works. And join the X Essential sessions, as no doubt there'll be a whole bunch of guys with no doubt much more experience than myself in a whole bunch of different areas who will be sharing what they know over the next year as well. And enjoy your build time. You've now got plenty of time left to get everything ready for 2020. All right, I'm going to stop recording.